Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing a die cut Sculpted Flowers tutorial using the Serenity Garden collection from Spellbinders. We have the Primrose die set, the Poetic Foliage die set, as well as the Astrantia die. I absolutely love all the texture in these flowers. There's also a 3D embossing folder, perfect for adding texture to our backgrounds of our cards. This one is called Ode to a Poet, and it's really quite unique. For the sentiments for these cards, I'm going to be bringing out a press plate from a previous collection. This is the Poet's Garden Sentiment press plate and die set. I'm going to create 3 cards in this video, so I'm going to create 3 sentiments for those cards and then die cut them so they're ready to go while I'm creating. So I'm using my Better Press system for creating these sentiments. We could also use these press plates in the Glimmer system if we wanted foiled sentiments, but for these cards, because those flowers have a lot of texture to them, I wanted the sentiments to have some embossed texture to them. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my hammer mill cardstock that I have on the clear plate. I am inking my plates up with some Versamark ink. I put the clear plate with my cardstock on top of the base and then run it through my Platinum 6 machine to press those sentiments into the cardstock. I'm going to heat emboss these with some silver embossing powder, and anytime I do sentiments, especially Better Press sentiments, I do try to use super fine embossing powder. It just shows up the detail just a little bit better than regular powder. Regular will work here, but the ultra fine or the super fine just shows them just a little bit better. The regular powder, the results are a little bit on the thicker side. This is a little bit more detailed. So once I have the powder onto those pressed sentiments, I can use my embossing tool to melt that powder on there. And if you've never done embossing before, it goes from a rough, matte, granular look to a nice, shiny, metallic look because I'm using metallic embossing powder here. I let that embossing cool down for probably 10-15 seconds, and then I match up the different dies for those sentiments. I use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to tape those dies in place. I don't want those dies moving on me while I'm putting it through my machine, so taping it in place is the best way to make sure they're going to stay where I want them to go. Once I have these die cut, I can set them aside and we can start creating some of the flowers for the cards. That way our sentiments are ready to go. We can just pick and choose which ones we want for the cards that we're creating. The first flower that I'm going to create is the Primrose from the Primrose die set. I have all of my pieces die cut out of some hammer-mill cardstock here. Now, I love using Distress Inks and Interference Inks with these dies for coloring them. Susan Tierney Cockburn, who is the designer for these dies, regularly does videos for the Spellbinders channels where she shows you how to use these dies and how to put them together. And she always used alcohol ink markers for coloring her images. So I thought I'd use some Copic markers for coloring the die cuts. So for the first, or for the leaves for the Primrose here, I'm using YG 63 and 67. I start with the lighter one and then go in with the darker one to put some shading, and then go back with the lighter one to blend those two colors together. So you can color these die cuts any way you want. Like I said, I typically will do Distress Ink, sometimes Interference if I want them to have a bit of shimmer. You could also just use colored cardstock if you want. You could use colored cardstock with some ink blending. So I definitely recommend trying a few different ways and seeing which ways are your favorite. For the center parts of the flowers, I'm using Y17, and I'm just kind of flicking the color from the inside out so that we have a line that is a little bit jagged, a little bit rough. We don't have a smooth line here. I have RV04, 19, R39 for coloring the rest of the petals. Now, if you go look up Primrose and look up images of them, there's so many different color combinations that you can create with, so you can really have a lot of fun and customize them to the colors that you're wanting. You can see that I'm coloring these really quickly. These don't need to be colored perfectly because we're also going to be shaping them. We're not going to be seeing these die sets or these die cuts flat like this. That shaping is going to add a lot of texture to it, and it's also going to be forgiving for any imperfect coloring if you think it's not great. So I start with that RV04, I go in with the RV19, and then I do the R39 right on the edge of the petal. I do go back in with that RV04 and just blend those two together, or those three together, so that we have a nice blend between all of them. And I also go back in with that Y17 to blend that into the pink just a little bit more. Because we're starting with white cardstock, it's definitely best to color both sides of these die cuts. The other side, or the opposite side doesn't need to be colored perfectly, but just so that there's a little bit of color when we go to shape these pieces. Sometimes we twist them and we see the back side of it, so it's nice to have some color there. The center of the flower was just colored with YG63, and then I used my reverse tweezer to twirl that, to spin it together and glue it together, and I also use that reverse tweezer to hold it in place. For shaping the leaves, I have a paper sculpting tool here. This is a paper sculpting kit from Spellbinders. It is discontinued. I will link one that is comparable in the supply list in my description, as well as all of the other supplies that I'm using. But I'm using a tool that has like almost like a die pick, but it's got a curved end to it. So that's for adding some lines and striations to the leaves. And then I'm using my reverse tweezers to curl the edges of the leaves. So I use those reverse tweezers on the center spine of the leaf as well as curling it. The great thing about reverse tweezers is you squeeze them to open them up. You don't squeeze them to hold them closed. So for something like this, it's really handy to be able to have a tool that holds that paper while the tweezers are closed and not have to be holding it closed with your hands while you're trying to spin it and tweeze it and curl those leaves as well as the petals. For the petals themselves, I'm using that same tool to add the striations to the petals. I'm doing this one on a foam pad. This is like a thick foam. It's almost like a mouse pad, but it's really quite thick and dense. The first piece that I used for those leaves was a piece, it was almost like chipboard, like mat board. It had some give to it, but not nearly as much as the foam mat here. Once I've used the tool to do the striations on it, I use those reverse tweezers just to add a little bit of curl to those petals. Then I add some liquid glue to the center of the petal or the center of the flower, glue those two pieces together, and then glue the center to the flower. And I do use liquid glue for this. That way you can move and shimmy those pieces in place. The great thing about liquid glue is that you can move it in place, but you do want to wait for it to dry between different stages of creating these flowers, so that when you're adding different pieces together, you're not having other pieces fall apart because the glue isn't set. And this makes more sense for the Astrantia flower than it does for this one here. For the layer on my card here, I use the Playful Stitch Panels die set and just have a flat panel there. I used the Copic marker, the R39, the darkest color, to add a border around that so it looks like it's matted with another color. It matches exactly the flowers because we're using one of the Copic markers for creating those flowers. And I use the chisel end of the Copic marker. You have just a little bit more control when you're using that chisel end. You use the long end along the edge of that cardstock. Now, I only created 3 of the flowers at this point and was adding the leaves and decided there wasn't quite enough flowers. I just had really too many leaves for the flowers. So I am going to be creating more flowers off screen and adding it to this cluster. So we have a lot more than just 3 flowers in the cluster. And for this particular card, I added the leaves all the way around the flowers as if we're looking at the flowers from above and we see the leaves underneath it. You could also do the flowers towards the top and have the leaves underneath them. So it looks almost like a side view of them. Really depends on what you're looking for. I also used all of the leaves that I had created, and I really didn't need to use quite that many. I think, in my opinion, after the fact, it's a little bit too many, but you can pick and choose how many you want. And because you have that liquid glue, if you put that leaf in there and you just really don't like it, it's too much, you can always take it out. When I'm gluing the leaves as well as the flowers, for the leaves, I just put the glue at the base of the leaf by the stem. For the flowers, I just put it in the center of the flower. I don't put glue all over the back. When I have those pieces down, I do let them dry for a little while before moving that card. I want to make sure that everything is nice and secure. I can also use a die pick for poking those flowers down to make sure that that glue has some contact. But you can see as I'm working here, sometimes I'm putting a different flower in place, dislodges another one because that glue hasn't quite dried yet. Once it's dry, it's nice and secure, but while we're putting it together, we have a lot of room, a lot of flexibility. and you just have to make sure that once you have everything together like you want it, you have everything, or the glue has good contact with things, you let it sit for a few minutes. Now here is where you could see the backside of some of those petals. I didn't color the backside, and it wasn't until I had my whole piece done that I realized that I had not colored the backside of that second set of petals for those flowers. So that's why I definitely recommend making sure to color both sides, or if you use colored cardstock, you don't need to do that. For the second card, we're using the Astrantia die. So this one has a ton of tiny little flowers for the center of that piece. I'm using the R59 Copic marker to color both sides of these. This is one that I definitely would recommend just using some colored cardstock for. It makes it a whole lot easier. However, the nice thing about using a Copic marker is it dampens that paper just a tiny little bit. So when I use my small stylus to press the pattern, or press that cup into those flowers, that moisture does help. It kind of helps set that scoop, or that shape into the cardstock. So if you use regular cardstock, colored cardstock, and you're doing this, I would maybe mist it with just a touch of water before pressing that small stylus in there, and then it will dry and be in that little cup shape. Once I have all of those flowers done, I poured it into the top part of one of my craft stacks. I could see easily that one of them I had forgotten to color the other side of the paper, so it was easy enough to fix, but definitely easier to have colored cardstock to start. For the base part of this flower, I'm coloring it with RV04 and RV10, using the RV04 over the whole base, and then just doing some of the RV10 from the center of the flower going out. I'm also using that RV04 for those little star pieces that you see to my right. There are 4 of them. 2 of them are larger, 2 of them are smaller. These are for the center pieces of that flower. And then we have that little stamen roll, just like the last Primrose die set, except this one's just a little bit bigger. That one is also going to be colored with the RV04. And those are other pieces that you could just use some light paint cardstock in order to do those pieces, and rather than color them. It really, again, just depends on personal preference. Now, after using the RV04 and RV10, I decided there just wasn't enough contrast. So I went in and grabbed the RV19 and added some more color depth towards the center of the flower. Then I'm using the same colors for the backside, and I'm going to be using that RV04 to blend them together. Typically when I blend Copic markers together, I'll use the light, then the medium, then the dark, and then I go back in with the medium color to blend everything together. When it comes to these flowers, sometimes I'll go back to that medium color, and sometimes I'll just go right to the light color, because it doesn't need to be perfectly blended, because these are shaped flowers and they're a little bit more organic. This one here, I'm also using Tombow number 757. This is kind of the same color as the RV19, just a little bit darker. These flowers have just teeny tiny lines along their petals, and I don't have a Copic marker or permanent marker that is that color, so I'm just using that Tombow marker. It works perfectly, and you can even take the Copic markers and blend right back over top of them, and it works totally fine. It doesn't move that Tombow marker at all. I added a little bit of the RV19 at the tip of that flower, and then I go back in with that RV04 and just blend everything together, and that's where you can really tell that it doesn't touch that Tombow marker at all. It doesn't blend it, it doesn't smear it, it doesn't make it bleed in any way, shape, or form. So then I'm going to use that RV04 for those center star little pieces. Again, these are little pieces for the center of the flowers, and all of those teeny tiny flowers that we colored first, they're going to be glued at the ends of these pieces here. So I colored both of those the same color, and I didn't add any shading to those because those are just kind of foundation pieces on the inside of the flowers. Those little teeny tiny flowers are going to be glued on top of it, so we're not really going to see a whole lot of that anyways. For the shaping for these petals, I'm using that little stylus piece that has the curve at the end just to add some kind of stripe marks. We really don't see them a lot. It just adds a little bit of shape to that flower. Then I pull in my foam piece, use a medium stylus, and I didn't even bother putting it into my tool-in-one set for this piece here. Add a little bit of a cup to the center of that flower, and then I use my fingers to curve those petals back. Now I'm using that reverse tweezers to kind of twist the ends of the petals. This is something that Susan had shown in her video, and I just really like the look of it. I'm not twisting every single one the same way. Some of them I'm going clockwise, some of them I'm going counterclockwise, just to add a little bit of variety to them. I'm doing the same thing to both of those pieces, and then I'm going to glue them together and then set that aside to dry. For this flower, because there's so many different pieces to it, I want to give the pieces a little bit of time to dry before completely assembling those cards. For those star pieces, the ends kind of have two little bulbs on them. So we're using a small stylus to press into each one of those bulbs. Each one of those bulbs that are pressed are going to have one of those flowers glued on top of it. Now, Susan had done 2 on each of the top of these from the center of the stylus as well. Those are just little singular bulbs, so I'm not sure how she was able to get 2 different presses out of that. So I just left it with 1 for these ones here. Now, the one thing I did do wrong here is I pressed each one of those bulbs and then I pressed the center on the same side. What it should be is I should flip it over and press it on the opposite side. And I realized that when I'm starting to assemble it, and I do reverse them, but the flowers will be facing the right way if you press the little tiny bulbs at the end of those stars on one side, flip it over, and then press the center part of the flower on the opposite side. So I'm going to use that liquid glue to glue these teeny tiny flowers here. What works best is just having a little pool of glue on your work surface. I put it right on my media mat here. You could easily just put it on, say, a sour cream container lid or something that you can just toss away afterwards. Sometimes the reverse tweezers work best, but I do find that sometimes I get a little bit of glue on those reverse tweezers and they just really want to stick to the die cuts themselves rather than letting them go. I end up using the wax tip tool from my handy tool set, and that's the one that I found worked the best overall. It kind of fits in that little cup of those flowers, so it makes it easy to lift them up, dip them in the glue, and then add them to the top of those little spines or little, I don't know what those things are called. This is when I went and I reversed all the other ones for the center of the flowers. I had realized my mistake and realized it was looking much better once I had reversed them. So I'm going to add all of these little flowers to the ends, and then I'm going to let those completely dry, because to add each one of these inside of the other ones, I think those flowers are just going to fall off if that glue isn't completely set. So while I have them setting, I'm going to be coloring and shaping the leaves. Now I'm just doing this one here on screen. The other 3 I'm going to be doing off screen. You can see that even when the glue is dry, the flowers pretty much stay on there, but I don't want to test it too much. So I did the rest of those off screen and set those to the side. For the leaves, they're going to be fairly similar to the leaves from the Primrose in that I'm using YG63 and YG67, starting with the 63, going in with the 67, adding some darker shading, and then going back with that 63 and blending those 2 together. For this, when it comes to the back side of the leaf, I just do the 63 and just color over the whole thing. Now, while that cardstock is still damp from the alcohol ink marker on there, I'm using my reverse tweezers. I'm using them to kind of press a center to the leaf, and then I'm using them on the corners and the tips of the leaves just to twirl them and curve them. Some of them are curved down, some of them are curved up. Try to make it a little bit random. I don't want all of those leaves to be identical, but because it's still wet from the alcohol ink marker, it's going to dry with that curve in it, just give them a little bit more stability. So now that we have the center pieces of the flowers completely dry, I added another pool of glue right on my surface. Then I'm dipping those pieces into that glue, putting it into the center of the flower, and then using my small stylus just to press that in place. Off screen, I also put the rest of the flowers that I had left over on the center stamen part of the flower, and here is it completely finished. I absolutely love all of the different texture to those flowers. These collections from Susan Tierney Cockburn are really great for learning your flowers, learning the different pieces to them, because I can't say I've ever looked at flowers quite the same since doing some of these shaped flowers, because they have so many different pieces that I never really noticed before. For the background for this card, I also have a panel from the Playful Stitch panels. I embossed it with that Ode to a Poet embossing folder. You can see the first time I did this, I was trying to go a little bit too fast and my Copic marker slipped. So you definitely want to take your time with this and make sure that it doesn't slip within the edge of that cardstock, because it obviously doesn't look the same. For the second piece that I did to correct it, I actually did a smaller panel of that Playful Stitch panels, just so that there's a little bit more space around the outside edges. Once I had embossed this, I used a little bit of Lost Shadow Distress ink just to bring out the texture of that embossing folder. It's got such a unique look to it that I thought it would be fun to add that, or to enhance that texture and just really bring it out. And I didn't want to bring any more colors into this, so by just using some Lost Shadow, I thought it was a great way to show that off and have something that complemented the flower as well as the silver embossing for the sentiments. So I glued that to my A2 card base, and then I'm going to glue my sentiment down. I want to make sure that I leave proper room for that sentiment. This one I'm just using the thank you sentiment. Then I'm going to put the flower in the center and then add my leaves behind it. And when I was creating my pieces for this card, I had 6 leaves that I created all together. I end up only using 3 because after just using that 3, I thought it was perfect and I didn't want to overcrowd it with greenery. So I used 2 of the larger ones, 1 of the smaller one. I can save those extra leaves for a future project if you want. You can see here, I'm just kind of putting it behind there and decided not to use it. I didn't want to hide that embossed background either. So by just adding this, we still see some of that texture from the embossed background. We have the background with those leaves, but it's not overwhelming. For the last card, I'm going to be using that embossing folder for my background, and I'm going to be using it with the Poetic Foliage die set. Now for this one, I'm taping my Hammermill cardstock in my embossing folder and using that Lost Shadow Distress ink to ink the embossing folder itself. This is a technique that I use quite often because I just really like the look of it. The Lost Shadow is a really light ink. Typically when I do this technique, I'll do it with a dark ink for more of a dramatic look to it. This is going to have more of a subtle look to it. However, because it's a lighter ink, we're going to have to do this a bit more times in order to completely cover, because the distress ink kind of starts to bead up on that embossing folder, so it looks blotchy at first. So we want to do this as many times till we get the look that we're going for. Typically when I'm doing this with a darker ink, usually about 3 or 4 times is enough, but I think I end up doing it 5 times in this. I didn't really count. I just know it was definitely more than the 3 times. And even at that, the ink isn't completely solid on that background. It still has some lighter areas and darker areas, which I don't mind. I always like having some darker areas and lighter areas because I think it looks a little bit more visually interesting. But again, you can do this technique till you have the coverage that you want and the look that you want. I'm doing this with Lost Shadow. You could do it with whatever color you wanted. Again, I wanted to have color on this background, but I didn't want it to overwhelm the die cuts. I wanted those to be the star of the show. So once we have as much ink as we want on that background, I'm using my trimmer to trim that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I will cut another piece of Hammermill cardstock 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and that is going to be the mat to go behind this embossed piece. Then I'm going to color my little fern leaves, and for that Poetic Foliage die set, I chose to use the fern leaves. I'm doing them with that YG 63 and 67. I'm doing the 63 all over the whole leaf, then the 67 just towards the center, and then the 63 again to blend those two together. These are not going to be shaped. I'm going to be putting them on this card flat, so I don't even bother coloring the back side of it because we're not going to see it. But you certainly could if you wanted to. Or, like I've said a couple times in here, you could just use some colored cardstock and then do some ink blending on it. So either way will absolutely work. I just wanted to try it with the alcohol ink markers just to see if I liked this better than the distress inks or the ink blending that I typically do or not. There's no right or wrong way. Again, you could even do watercolor cardstock and use watercolors to color in these pieces. I think that would be fabulous as well. The only thing with watercolor cardstock is it's just a little bit thicker, so the paper shaping is going to be just a tiny bit more challenging. For those fern leaves, we have 2 large ones and 3 small ones. In order to make them a little bit more size or give them a little bit more size variety, I just take the bottom of some of the die cuts just to shorten them just a little bit so it doesn't look like we have 2 different sizes. That way it looks more like a cluster of natural ferns. So I glued the two larger ones or taller ones on first, and then I'm putting these smaller ones in front of them to finish off that cluster. I did put my sentiment on there so that I knew exactly where I wanted it to go. I wanted my ferns to be kind of growing up from behind there. And by having that sentiment there, I could easily tuck it in because I'm using that liquid glue. I can easily tuck pieces in there because the glue isn't set yet, but I know exactly where I want the base of those ferns to be. And here's the final result, a super simple card, but we've got lots of texture to it because of that embossed background, the inking on the embossed background. And I forgot to mention, I used some bundled sage distress ink on the front part of that embossed background just to add a little bit more color to it. Then we have our second card with the Astrantia flower. I absolutely love the final look of this flower. I just think it's so pretty. And this comes in a couple different colors as well, so you can get creative with the colors that we use. And then our very first one with those primroses, perfect for spring. And again, those could be done in so many different colors. And you can see that side profile, how much dimension these flowers have to them. These are all on cards, and I would typically hand deliver one of these cards. I wouldn't be putting them in an envelope. You could also use them in a frame for some home decor. And I've done that before in a past video, so I'll link that at the end here if you want some more inspiration on ways to use some of these flowers dies. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.